Let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years.
She was the worst Secretary of State in the history of the United States.
But you used to donate, you gave a lot of money to her over the years.
Because I was a businessman, I guess I still am, but I was a businessman, I was with everybody. Everybody loved me. When I called them, they always treated me well. And that's part of the game. And that's part of what's wrong with this country. Because as a businessman, I could have gotten anything from anybody. And that is part of the problem. Lobbyists, donors, special interests.
Is that why you were donating money to people you donated? Because you donated to Democrats. I think in 2006, you gave $20,000 to the Democratic Congressional Campaign Fund. You gave $1,000.
Democrats and Republicans. I get along with everybody.
To Republicans.
Oh, whatever. But I've given millions. I've given millions to everybody.
So do you give, though, based on principles, or do you give based on who's going to do things for you politically?
They all love me. Let's put it that way. They all love me. I did very nicely in life. And frankly, you give, and it's part of the problem. And I talk about it all the time. Part of the problem.
So even though you're doing it, you're saying it's a problem?
Well, I'm saying this. They won't necessarily do what's right for the country. They'll do what's right for their special interest, their donor, their lobbyist, etc.
We're talking with Dr. Martin Gilens, professor of politics at Princeton University. and co-author of this brilliant new study, Testing Theories of American Politics. So you looked at the preferences of the economic elites, the top 90th the 90th percentile and above income group, of special interest groups and of average citizens with regard to each one of these three groups with regard to over roughly 2,000 individual policy prescriptions, but attempted legislation over the past 20 some odd, almost 30 years.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, to recap. And what did you find?
Well, we found that economic elites and interest groups have a substantial influence over government policymaking, but that ordinary citizens have essentially none. The image that I think many people still cling to of America as a place where average, middle-class individuals play some important role in determining what their government does just is not the case.
A lot of people in my own state of Vermont and around the country ask me, what really goes on in Washington? Why do certain pieces of legislation get passed, other pieces of legislation not get onto the floor? And unfortunately, this enormously important issue, which gets to the heart and soul of the problems with our democracy right now, doesn't get the kind of discussion that it deserves from the corporate media for obvious reasons. How did it come about that Congress deregulated Wall Street so they could basically do anything they want, sell worthless derivatives, do the subprime mortgage business with it, which they did, which brought us to where we are? How does it happen that over a year after the crisis, Congress has not yet acted in a forceful way to go forward with real financial reform? Might it have something, my friends, with the fact that over the last 10 years, the financial interests on Wall Street have spent over $5 billion, yes, $5 billion on campaign contributions and lobbying activities? $5 billion. Well, you ask, let's get off of Wall Street. What about prescription drugs? How is it that in the United States of America, we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs? In some cases, 2 or 3 times the price for the same exact drugs sold in Canada or in Europe. Do you think maybe it has something to do with the fact that since 1998, the pharmaceutical industry has spent over $1.6 billion on lobbying, and that maybe it has some effect, some reason related to the fact that they have over 1,100 lobbyists right here in Washington? That's more than 2 for every member of Congress. The amount of money we spend on the military, despite the end of the Cold War, goes up and up and up. Do you think it has something to do with the fact that over the past decade, the defense industry has spent more than $447 million on lobbying and $144 million in campaign contributions? ExxonMobil, year after year, record-breaking profits, working people pay very high prices at the gas pump. Bottom line here is you got a horrendous situation in which big money controls to a very significant degree the agenda. If you don't have the money, you get to the end of the line.
As a result of the disastrous Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case, the American political system has been totally corrupted, and the foundations of American democracy are being undermined. When one family spends more money than either of the 2 major political parties, that is not democracy, that is oligarchy. And that is why we have got to overturn Citizens United. And why we need public funding of elections. I see a lot of young people here today. And I want our young people to be able to run for office if they want to and not have to beg money from the rich and the powerful to do that.
No president, no progressive president can succeed unless there are millions and millions and millions of people actively involved in the struggle every single day. If anybody in this room thinks, well, gee, I hope Bernie runs for president, I'll vote for him, I'll support him, I'll send him $25, and I'll wish him the best of luck. It doesn't work that way.
The answer, of course, is public funding of elections. We've begun to see some good things at the statewide level. But if you're concerned about public policy in general in this country, healthcare, the environment, whatever it may be, we've got to pay attention about the power of big money in terms of their campaign contributions and their lobbying activities.